What is up, everyone? Welcome back to the Long Lens Podcast. This is the podcast where I answer questions from my YouTube and filmmaking community, and we just talk about YouTube and filmmaking. So today we have another Q&A podcast. And again, if you're new here, this is kind of like the main focus of this podcast is to do a Q&A. So you ask the questions, I answer them. And the way that I like to do it is I'll always answer the questions that my Patreon supporters set in first. They get priority. I try to answer their questions first and then give them a little shout out on this podcast. But this month, we actually don't have any new questions from my Patreon supporters, which is totally fine. I kind of expect that not every single month we're going to have a bunch of new questions, but we still have a good amount of questions from the YouTube community page and from Instagram as well. So I'm going to get to those. Just as a little gear update, if anyone wants to know, there is a video version of this podcast you can watch on YouTube on my second channel. It's called Nigel Barros 2. So just my name and then TOO. And normally I would film my podcasts on my trusty S5 IIX, but I decided to try something different just for the heck of it. And I'm shooting this whole podcast on the Panasonic G85. It's a very cheap camera, micro four thirds, and we're shooting on the 25mm f1.7. So if you want to see what that looks like, you can check out the video version of this podcast. And the nice thing is that you can record continuously on the G85. So that's pretty cool. I'm going to take my hoodie off. It's actually kind of warm up here. So the first question that we have on the YouTube community page is the best cheap Sony camera under $600. Now, I don't know if the ZV-E10 is under $600, but that's the first Sony camera that would come to mind if you want to shoot video. I know that one's really good. A lot of people use it. Shoots an S-Log 3. Doesn't have 10-bit, I don't think, but it still shoots a really nice 8-bit image. That's 4K, really sharp. So that's the first camera that I'd probably suggest. You could also look into like the Sony A64, 65, 6300s if you're really on a tight budget. The only problem with those cameras is that they have Sony's older color science. So you're not going to get as good as skin tones on those cameras, and they tend to overheat a lot, but they still shoot a very nice 4K image. So if you can work with getting past some of the color issues and you don't need to record really long video files, then those cameras are good options as well. There is also the vlogging options of like the Sony ZV-1, but I personally wouldn't go for those if you're looking for your first like main camera. I would look to the ZV-E1 as like a secondary B cam if you really wanted something that was, smaller sensor and just, had everything built in. But yeah, those are the cameras that I would look for. The Sony ZV-E10, if you can find it for that price, and then 64, 65, A6300s. Those are good as well. All right, the next question is, what do you think about the BMPCC 4K in 2024 and 5 years ahead? Honestly, the Blackmagic Pocket 4K still gives a really nice looking image. Shoots in Blackmagic RAW, shoots in ProRes, which shooting in ProRes internally is something that some of the even newer Blackmagic cameras won't do. But I've always liked the image that camera spits out. I've just never liked the form factor in which the camera comes in. So that was my only real gripe, is the form factor of the camera. There have been people that have been modifying cameras like that and the 6K, giving them flip screens and stuff like that, which I've talked about before on this podcast. But I like that camera. I still think that the image will hold up for years to come. The only thing I don't like about it is the form factor. So, I talked about this with my buddy Nate on the last podcast, but if Blackmagic could give us a smaller FX3 sized camera, or even like a small box camera, like a Z camera or something like that, and just gave us the same type of image that the Blackmagic 4K gives us, I would go with it for sure. Yeah, that's my only gripe with the Blackmagic Pocket cameras, at least the newer versions, is they're not pocketable and they're very awkwardly shaped. So yeah, the original Blackmagic Pocket was one of my favorite cameras. The Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera was great, but ever since they moved to like the bigger form factor cameras, it just kind of has been throwing me off. But again, the image is amazing. I still know people to this day that make their entire career off of the Blackmagic Pocket 4K cameras. So still great looking image, and probably the best image, price to image ratio. It's really hard to beat with the Blackmagic Pocket 4K. All right, the last question that I have on the YouTube community page is, you have any plans to get into narrative filmmaking anytime soon? And if so, what type of films do you want to make? Narrative, yes. So documentaries can be narrative filmmaking. I would get into documentaries, but again, I'm not really drawn to like long form documentaries. 15 to 20 minute documentaries, those are the type of, projects that I'd be interested in working on. I'm not really big on like taking an entire year of my life to film something. I'm just too impatient. So I like shorter documentaries that I can film, edit, and release to the world a lot quicker. So, fictional narrative stuff like, movies, I have no interest in doing that. And I know I'm kind of in the minority because everyone kind of they grow up wanting to be the next, Steven Spielberg or Peter Jackson. But I have really never had any interest in making full-blown movies. That just seems like a very long and daunting and a task that requires a lot of patience, which I don't really have when it comes to making videos, it seems. So, okay. And those are all the questions from the YouTube community page. And I'm going to go on to Instagram. And I did get a few good questions on Instagram. So the first question is, what do you want to see next for Lumix cameras, full frame and micro four thirds? Personally, full frame, I would love to see Lumix come out with a camera that is like the A7C. So like a range style finder camera. But honestly, cameras they're not as interesting to me right now. Right now, what I want from Lumix or Sigma, but I just really want a pancake lens, like a really good pancake lens for L mount. The Sigma Contemporaries, those are not pancake lenses. Those things are still like the size of like a small soda can. I want something that's like an actual pancake size so that I can take something like my S5 IIX, sling it around my shoulder, and the lens isn't going to be bumping into people. You know what I mean? That's what I really want more than anything. I don't really care. The S5 IIX does everything that I need it to do as far as video goes. So cameras aren't necessarily like a big priority for me. I just want smaller lenses. Because, that's why I'm still using the G85, just because it's so small. I'm using the 25mm f1.7 right now, but if I slapped a 14mm f2.5, you would barely even be able to tell that there's a lens on there. It's so small. And I can sling that thing around my shoulder and climb up a mountain and barely ever feel that it's there. Or I can walk around town and I'm not going to have to worry about the lens that I'm using, like bumping into people. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm really eager for, is smaller lenses for L mount. And that's one of the reasons why, if the GH7 comes out and it's essentially could replace an S5 IIX, I could see myself switching back to micro four thirds, because being a YouTube creator and being someone who's very introverted and doesn't like to draw a lot of attention to myself, even this S5 IIX is still a little bit too big. When I bring this out, people are assuming that I'm doing some photo shoot or, making some indie film or something like that. And I don't want any attention drawn to me when I'm making videos in public. I want no one to even notice my camera, think that I'm a tourist or something like that. So yeah, I know that I'm probably in the minority when it comes to that thinking. I know that every other filmmaker wants to have a big camera rig and just look super cool or whatever. I don't care about that. I just want my camera to be as easy to use as possible, but still give me the type of image that's going to look really good. And that might be where I just need to have one dedicated filmmaking camera and then one dedicated walk around town B-roll fun camera, which is kind of what my G85 is right now. But it will probably be replaced by something else in the future, because I'm kind of I'm going through a phase where I'm just buying cameras again that I used to use and just kind of falling in love with them again. It's kind of a long-winded answer, but those are the things that I want in the Lumix full frame lineup. I want smaller lenses. If they come out with an S1H Mark II or something, that's great. I won't be buying it. But yeah, smaller lenses, and then maybe a range finder style camera like the Sony A7C, but in the L mount. That would be pretty cool. And then if the GH7 could make me switch, I might switch out of full frame and go back to micro four thirds. I don't actually know. Okay, the next question is, do you think Lumix will ever actually make an FX6/FX9 competitor? I kind of have a feeling that Lumix is more focused on hybrid style cameras like this and not so much their EVA 1 line of video centered cameras, because the EVA 1 is that's a quote unquote cinema camera. And that's where you see the differences between Sony and Lumix. I think a lot is where Lumix is focusing mostly on hybrid cameras like this for people who shoot photos and videos. So if you're a Lumix shooter, the only way up that you can go as far as being in the Lumix system, the only higher level I can go besides this S5 Mark IIX is an S1H or the S1H Mark II, right? There isn't a cinema camera that I can eventually graduate to. Whereas if I was shooting, let's say on a Sony camera, like an A6700, there's an obvious upgrade path from the A6700 to something like an FX30. You can upgrade from the FX30. There's an obvious upgrade path to the FX6 or the FX9. And if you're with an FX6 or FX9, there's an obvious upgrade path to a Burano or a Venice. That isn't the same with Lumix. Lumix, like their top of the line video camera, which is Netflix approved, is the S1H, but there's nothing higher than that. I mean, there's the Eva 1, but that's like 5 years old now, and they haven't really upgraded that. And I don't see them talking about ever upgrading that camera at all. So I don't know if they're going to come out with an FX6 or FX9 competitor. It'd be sick if they did. It'd be sick if they took the Eva 1 and made it something that you could upgrade to from something like this S5 IIX. But I don't personally see that happening anytime soon. So, all right, the next question is thoughts on the G85S. It's great. I just did a video on the G85, which you can check out right there. That's on my main channel. G85S is great. It has a multi-aspect sensor, so it's actually slightly bigger than Micro Four Thirds. I think it's like a 1.8 or a 1.9 crop instead of 2x, which was the same with like the GH2. The GH2 had a multi-aspect sensor, and so it was a little bit bigger than like a GH3 sensor, which I think is cool because it's kind of in the middle of like, Micro Four Thirds and APS-C. So you get slightly wider field of view on the GH5S. There's no in-body image stabilization with the S version as opposed to just the regular GH5. So that's the reason why I went for the GH5, is because they had that in-body image stabilization and it's cheaper. Yeah, it's better in low light than the original GH5. So those are the things that are cool about the GH5S. I would say if you're looking for a first camera and you're getting the GH5S because you want better low light, I would almost say go with something like an S5 instead, because it'll be better in low light than a GH5S will. But if you want to stick with Micro Four Thirds, get slightly better low light, and have a slightly bigger sensor, the GH5S is great. All right, next question is, any practical tips on how to engage and encourage someone you are interviewing for a narrative doc? Yeah, so that's that's a hard question to answer. I've been very fortunate that like most of the narrative or doc style stuff that I've done have been with people that I'm, pretty comfortable with already. Like I have done some like doc style work where I don't necessarily know the person that well, but luckily he would be, probably considered a producer asking the actual like interview questions. So I was just running camera. It's a lot easier for me to interact or, ask questions to the subject of that video if I know them a little bit. So that's one thing that I would say is if you can try to like even just have like a little bit of a conversation, try to, introduce yourself, talk with them before you ever start rolling the camera. As soon as you pull out the camera, they start acting differently and they get really nervous and, jittery. So try to get to know them as much as you can on like a personal level before you turn the camera on them, and whether or not the documentary calls for this, I feel like it does help to not have them look directly into the lens, like having them look slightly off and actually talk to you. Like you should always be slightly off camera if you're going to be asking the questions for them to answer. Looking that way, you shouldn't be, standing behind the camera and then telling them to look into nothing. But yeah, those are the only tips that I really have for trying to get people to loosen up a little bit when you're doing a doc style interview. All right, next question is, what was the very first YouTube video you ever watched? It was probably a skate video. Probably someone pirated a skate video, back in the day. Well, like when did YouTube become a thing? Was that 2005, 2006? I can't remember, but I think the first video I ever watched was like a pirated skate video. So the next two questions are kind of similar, so I'm going to read them both off. The first one is, the S5 IIX isn't delivering on low light performance as well as I had hoped. Thoughts and advice. That's actually from my buddy Chris Tellez. He recently bought the S5 IIX. And the next question is, why is Panasonic's low light performance and AF so bad? So I'm not sure if this has to do with the S5 IIX, specifically. For Chris, I don't know which settings you're using or if you're talking about photography or video. Now, as far as photography goes, I'm not 100% sure why you're not getting good results. I feel like for video, the phase detection autofocus for these cameras can only do so much. There is dual native ISO on the S5 IIX, and I almost never shoot in anything but what the native ISO is. So it's either 640 on the low end or 4000 on the high end. I'm never shooting any of like the interim ISOs. I'll either add light or I'll add an ND filter. And I know it's not really going to matter when it comes to AF performance, but I would definitely say upgrade to the latest firmware if you haven't yet, because that's going to improve the AF a lot. I guess I would mess around with different focusing modes because some focusing modes work better than others. If you're using face and eye detect, especially on the old firmware, that misses a lot. And I think that most people have told me to use like multi-zone or, like the full area autofocus. and that tends to work better. I said in my last video that it's stupid that you can't use face and eye detect for detecting people's faces and eye. It works a lot better now though on the new firmware, so I would say that. And the next thing I'll say is face detect on these Lumix cameras still isn't quite at the Sony level. So if you're kind of on the fence about whether you like this camera or not, I mean, it's not going to hurt my feelings if you return it and go with a Sony. If low light autofocus is something that you really, really need. There's only so much that face detection can do, especially in low light. And for the next question, why is Panasonic's low light performance in AF so bad? Well, again, if you want better low light performance, shoot in the native ISO. So if you're in low light, you should be shooting at 4000. If 4000 still isn't letting in enough light, then you might need to invest in some lights or invest in a Sony camera instead if you want, to be shooting at 100,000 ISO or something like that and still have a clean image. The Lumix cameras are not trying to be like an A7S replacement. I think these are kind of more, especially the S5 IIX, it's more trying to compete on a level of like the Sony A7 IV, kind of in that range. They're not touting their low light capabilities necessarily. These aren't low light beasts like the Sony cameras are. That is assuming you're talking about full frame Lumix cameras. If you're talking about Micro Four Thirds, the reason that they're not good in low light is because the sensor is a lot smaller and they're a lot less sensitive to light. So you need a lot of light with Micro Four Thirds. Right now, again, I'm shooting on the G85. I have my ML30, not rocking the ML60 right now. I'm rocking the ML30. It's a 30 watt light. And this is shooting at 100% brightness right now, just to make sure that there's enough light exposing me for this video. So you do need a lot of light for Micro Four Thirds. That's why shooting in natural light and, lighting your stuff is going to be your best friend when shooting with these smaller sensored cameras. And again, you asked about the AF and why it's so bad. It's better now with the new firmware on the S5 II and S5 IIX. A lot better, I would say. You can watch this video if you want to check it out. I did little tests with the AF. And if you're asking why Micro Four Thirds Panasonic camera, autofocus is bad, every Micro Four Thirds Panasonic camera, aside from the G9 Mark II, uses contrast detection-based autofocus. And that's why it's so bad, because contrast-based detection focus is great in photos, but in video, it's constantly going to hunt and it's not going to be able to lock on to where you want it to lock on to. That's why the autofocus is bad with those type of cameras. If you want a Micro Four Thirds camera with good autofocus, you'll have to look at something like the EM1 Mark II, the EM1 Mark III, or the OM1 or OM1 Mark II by Olympus/OM Systems. Sometimes I still really do miss my Olympus EM1 Mark II because it was small, good 4K video, and it had face detection autofocus. That honestly, the Olympus EM1 Mark II's autofocus works better than this S5 IIX, at least the S5 IIX with its previous firmware. Now I think they're probably on par, but yeah, Olympus is a brand that people sleep on. The only problem is that they're not a video focused company. So even though they add video features, you're never going to see an Olympus camera on the set of a professional commercial or something like that. At least for the EM1 Mark II and Mark III, they're only 8-bit cameras, so the color isn't as good. And with the newer cameras that have 10-bit, they got a lot of other weird issues. That's kind of a tangent to say, if you're in Micro Four Thirds and you want a good autofocus camera, your options are an Olympus, either the EM1 Mark II or newer, or the G9 Mark II by Panasonic that was just released. Those are your options. And as far as the S5 Mark II and the S5 Mark IIX, update to the latest firmware, it'll improve the autofocus a lot. Anyways, those are the only questions that I had for this month's podcast. And if you'd like to ask a question, be sure to follow my main channel, Nigel Bajos. I'm going to leave that in the description as well. And then look at the community page, because the beginning of every month, I post in the community page, and that's where you can ask your questions. So you have to ask your questions in the comment section of the community page if you want to get them answered on the podcast. Other than that, you can also support me on Patreon, where not only are you going to get access to a bunch of free LUTs and tutorials and behind the scenes stuff and just a lot of perks on Patreon, you can also ask me questions. I ask for questions on Patreon too every single month, and those are the ones where I'll read your name, I'll answer your question, and you can just interact with me a lot more on Patreon. So anyways, once again, thanks so much for listening. Thanks for watching if you're here on YouTube, and I'll catch you all next time. Later.